Hello, this is Scott Metcalfe, and on behalf of my co-author, Andrea Pejrolo, we welcome you to this video series on music synthesis that accompanies the book Creating Sounds from Scratch, available from Oxford University Press. In this video and those that follow, we will explore subjects in each of the chapters of the book. In this first episode, I'm going to show you the basics of Tasman from Applied Acoustic Systems. It's a great sounding, powerful software synthesizer that also makes a useful teaching and learning tool for many types of synthesis. But to get started, we're going to look at the basics of building an instrument like the one that you see in front of you here. And we are right now looking at what's called the player mode of Tasman. And if I click on the button in the corner that says Builder, it'll take us over to the Builder side where we have modules that correspond to different components of an analog synthesizer and work in very much the same way. To understand the function of these different modules and how they all come together, let's start from scratch with a new instrument and put something together step by step. So to start off with, I've got a MIDI keyboard in front of me that you can't see, but I'm going to drag in a module called the Keys module. And the Keys module is going to interface with my hardware MIDI device. Up here at the top, you'll see a description saying that this is a monophonic keyboard, meaning that you can only have one note sounding at a time, similar to an older Moog instrument or even some of the modern Moog synthesizer instruments that are monophonic in design. The keyboard module mimics the output of the hardware keyboard on those old instruments. For example, it has an output gate signal and an output pitch signal. Now, what's the difference? A gate signal is simply an on-off switch. When a key is pressed on the keyboard, the output, that first output, sends a equivalent of a 1, very much like a 1 volt, if you will. And when the key is not pressed, it outputs nothing, or the equivalent of 0 volts. And what we'll end up doing later on is multiplying that signal with our audio chain, and when the audio signal is multiplied against a 1, we get an output signal. When it's multiplied against a 0, we do not. So let's take our Keys module and add the next part, which is going to be some kind of a sound generator. In this case, going with an analog type synth design, we're going to use a VCO, or a voltage controlled oscillator. The VCO has 3 inputs on the left side and 1 input on the right, and you'll notice that hovering the mouse over each gives us a brief description of what it does. So here we've got a frequency modulation input 1 and frequency modulation input 2, and then we also have control over what's called pulse width modulation. We'll look at that in a little bit. And on the output side, we have the basic output signal, the resulting sound of the oscillator. Now, for those of you that know a bit about frequency modulation synthesis, don't be confused. This is a little different than what's being described there, although there is a way that you could use Tasman in that manner. What this is intended for in our very basic design right now is to just take pitch information from our keyboard and have that modify the pitch of the oscillator. So for example, I'll come down here to the pitch output of the keys, bring that up and bring it into the first frequency modulation input. So depending on which key is pressed on the keyboard, that'll affect which pitch is being generated by the oscillator. All right, then this output has to go, if we're just building a very simple instrument, this output has to go out to the rest of the world here, to our audio interface. So I'm going to put a mono output here, just keep it simple. And you notice I've left a little space. The one thing that might be useful to throw in the way is it's under the envelopes folder, and I'm going to use volume. And it's an envelope, but it's a manual envelope, if you will, meaning it's just a volume slider that'll affect how much is passing through it. So I'm going to make those remaining connections here, and I'm going to jump over to the player side. All right. The volume slider is all the way down. If I bring it up, we can hear that the square wave that's currently selected in the waveform options for the VCO is what we're hearing. We've also got sawtooth wave. Let me bring this up. We've got white noise, and we've got a basic sine wave. All right. With each of those, we have the ability to manually change the pitch coarsely or fine-tune it. Now you'll notice with the coarse selector, there's a little triangle on top that when I click it turns green. The same is true with our modulation inputs down here at the bottom. If I click the green triangle on the top, it sets it to a unity or its normal position. That's going to be really useful for a few things. One, if we hit it up here at the top, we know we're going to keep in sort of Western tuning. And if we do it at the bottom, the same is going to be true. If we're modulating with our keyboard source and we're below the 12 o'clock position, we'll notice that our scale is compressed. It's not running a full octave. And if it's above the 12 o'clock position, we're ending up with a scale that expands beyond the normal octave range, even if we are just playing 12 semitones on the keyboard. Over here under the range setting, we can choose from 2 feet, 4 feet, 8 foot 16, and 32 feet settings. These you can think of as like organ pipes. The longer an organ pipe gets, the lower the frequency gets. So if I bring this back up a little bit and go to 2 and all the way down to 32 hertz, you'll hear that the octave range is changing there. So that could be very useful in designs, particularly when we have more than one VCO sounding at a time. So let me bring up the sawtooth wave for now. And you'll notice that as soon as I bring up the volume, we're hearing something. And I can tell you that I'm not pressing a key on the keyboard. However, when I do, when I play an octave on the keyboard, you'll notice that it does sound each step of the scale, but it keeps them playing. It doesn't shut them off. The reason for that is back here in the builder, where we haven't taken advantage yet of the gate output of our keyboard module. So what I'm going to do is grab a hold of these last two guys and break the connection between the VCO and the volume. And I'm going to go in here to find a module called the VCA. And the VCA stands for a voltage-controlled amplifier. A voltage-controlled amplifier is what I was describing earlier, in that we are multiplying each of the inputs together, and the product, the result of that, comes out the output here. So I'm going to send that along my audio chain. So I'm going to take the gate output here of my keyboard, and I'm going to plug that into one of the VCA inputs. And then I'm going to take the output of my VCO and plug that into the other. And then when I jump over here to the player side and bring up the fader, the first thing we notice is nothing. We don't hear anything until we hit a key on the keyboard. Right? So that's more the type of behavior you would expect out of a synthesizer. All right, now let's take this really simple instrument and add something to it to give a little bit more shape to the sound. Let's grab the envelope that is labeled as an ADSR, may be familiar to some of you, attack, decay, sustain, release. Now it's important to understand that the ADSR module defines 4 characteristics of the shape of the sound over time. Attack is a time component, decay is a time component, S or sustain is a volume definition, and then R, release, is a time component. So for example, if we are coming out of our keyboard module, and the way it is right now, if we strike a key, it goes from 0 to 1 in our output voltage without any delay, and as soon as we let go of the key, it drops back from 1 to 0, also instantaneously, both of which are going to be not terribly musical and potentially introduce a click as it goes on and off. So what we can do here is introduce a delay to the time that we go from 0 to 1, that's the attack stage. We go from 1 down to the resting sustain level, which may or may not be lower than the maximum 1 volt. And then when we let go of the key, if there's a length of time you want to define, which I always recommend to use a little bit at least, to go from that sustain level to all the way down. So let's take out the gate connection there right to the VCA, and we're going to interrupt it, so to speak, with this volume envelope here. So we're going to plug in our gate, come out of the volume envelope and into the VCA and jump over here. And now we've got this added module here. Incidentally, an interesting and useful feature in terms of organizing things in Taskman is that it looks at the layout of the modules from left to right in order to define where it falls in the player section. So if I just make sure that my volume envelope is to the right slightly of the VCO, then when I come over here, we notice that it's to the right of the VCO module. So now if I strike a key on the keyboard, all right, we can see the lights coming on. We'll set something in here a little bit more interesting, but we see these lights coming on indicating at what point it's in the attack stage, decay stage, when it's resting on the sustain, and then when I release the key, how long it stays in the release side. So let's bring down the sustain level so we can really hear this happening. And let's do a little bit more of an attack, a little bit more of a decay, and I'll hold down the key to rest on sustain, and then I'll release it. All right, so it's resting on sustain. Let go, and it runs through the release. Now that's following an exponential shape, curves through each of these stages. If we want to follow a more linear shape, we can choose linear here. And release. So you can hear the difference there, and just pick the one that sounds right to you. All right, now that we've created some shape to the volume over time, let's go in and add a tool that will allow us to affect the frequency spectrum. This is when we start getting into the idea of subtractive synthesis, when we have a complex waveform, one that's constructed with a lot of harmonics, and chipping away at those harmonics until we end up with a desirable sound, much in the same way that a sculptor will take a block of marble or wood and chip away at it until they end up with the shape that they're looking for. So let's jump back over to the player side here, and once again I'm going to make some room for a module to stick in here. So let's cut out the connection between the VCA and the volume, and let's add in, we've got a bunch of different filter options here. Let's start with a really simple one, which is called the low pass 2. And we're going to drop this right in place here and patch it into our audio chain. Jump over to the player, and here's our low pass filter. So we can set the cutoff frequency, the frequency where the signal sort of ramps down and we lose anything that's above it, and then our resonance control. Now these two components here, this low pass filter is so important to the sound of any analog synthesizer or any modeled analog synthesizer, for the reason that it's really the filter that defines the sound of that instrument. What makes a Moog sound different from an ARP synthesizer or an Oberheim synthesizer is primarily the design of that filter, what that filter sounds like. And that's both in terms of what it does to the sound when we engage the cutoff frequency, but equally, if not more so, what happens when we bring up the resonance. The resonance just adds a little bit of a lot of exaggeration right at the point where the cutoff frequency happens. So with a low pass filter, we're letting the low frequencies pass through, we're cutting the high frequencies, and then if we introduce any resonance, we're creating an exaggeration right at that point where the cutoff is occurring. So let's take our sawtooth wave. I'm going to again sound a pitch here. You notice already that it's got a darker quality than what we had before. Let's take the resonance off to start with. Bring it all the way up and we hear the original a sawtooth wave. Bring it down and we can end up with a Much darker quality to the sound. Listen though what happens when we bring up the resonance. We even get to the point with this filter that it starts to self-oscillate. So we can end up with quite a wide variety of sounds just by playing with this cutoff frequency and the resonance control. Let's look at one more of these before we move on. I'm going to delete that low pass 2 from the equation and bring in instead this V low pass 2, which adds an interesting element here. So let's slide this over to make a little bit of room. First thing we notice is that we have 3 inputs on the left side of this filter. So if I hover over again to these inputs, we see that we've got the input signal. That's what's going to come from the VCA. But then we have these 2 modulation options. We have a cutoff modulation input number 1 and cutoff modulation input 2. So there's a variety of things that we could do with these modulation inputs. We're not going to pass an audio signal in there, but we're looking to pass through some kind of a control voltage signal. So let's run through with the VCA here. First off, taking our audio signal from the VCO and run that into the audio input of the filter. But let's see, what if we had a envelope whose job was just to define the shape of our filter over time? That would be very useful. So let's take another ADSR and I'm going to stick it down here at the bottom. Notice I'm angling it a little bit to the right of the first one so that we can identify them easier in the player side. And then I'm going to take a gate signal into there. And in this case, it's not going right into a VCA, but it's going directly into the modulation input of our filter. So in other words, what we're doing is we're defining an envelope shape that is going to, although we won't see it happening, we'll hear it shaping how much high frequency content is present in the output signal as it flows through the steps of the envelope. So let's jump over. Well, take a look. Here's one problem that I sort of anticipated, but I'll show you first. We remember now that the filter envelope is the second one and the VCO envelope is the first one. But it might be nice for us to label those a little bit better so that it is clear to anybody else that might use our instrument, or even to us when we come back to use it in the future and have to jump over and look at our patching to understand what's going on. So this is going to be our volume envelope. Just by double clicking on the module, I can name that. And by double clicking on this guy here, I'm going to name that my filter envelope. All right, and maybe while we're at it, we'll just clean this guy up and call this VCO. Jump back over to the player side. All right, so now it's very clear what's going on here. I'm going to bring my sustain level up a bit, have a little bit more of an attack, take my release down. Here's my modulation input. I'm going to bring that all the way up for now, so it's really getting the full control voltage signal from this filter envelope. So much more variety to the sound. Now it's really starting to turn into something that could be useful for us. So just a quick review here. We've got a basic sawtooth wave. The sawtooth is following the shape, the volume shape that we're defining in this volume envelope. And then we've got this low-pass filter engaged here from which we're eliminating frequencies above a certain point, and we're adding some emphasis to that sound right at the point of the crossover, right at the point where the cutoff is happening. Yet we're defining a motion, if you will. We again don't see it happening, but the way the control voltage is behaving, it's effectively turning this up and then turning it back down at the time intervals defined in the attack and decay stages. If we have a longer release stage here, then we could actually use the release component here as well. And we hear it decay down. Let me do a little faster. So it's subtle with this design, but it's certainly happening. Last piece of the puzzle for this particular video is to add another control that affects a time variable, and that's called the LFO, or the low frequency oscillator. Unlike the VCO, which produces sound in the range of human hearing, the LFO is intended to produce a waveform below the human hearing range so that it has an effect on, say, the pitch, in which case it would act like a vibrato. We could use it to act like a tremolo type effect. We could also use it to modulate our second input of the low pass filter. So let's try a few of those things. First off, let's jump over here back to the builder side and grab an LFO. And just to start off with, let's say that this is going to be our vibrato control. And notice this display row. This is starting to get a little bit crowded. So I'm going to add this to the second row of our player side just to kind of keep it out of the way a little bit. And let's bring this guy up and have that feed the second modulation input of our VCO. And then let's just jump over and hear what that does to start off with. So here's a vibrato control. That's going to be coming into the second modulation input. So let me start off with just a sine wave is fine. And it's down at 15 BPM, so basically 15 beats per minute is it's defined there. We can control the frequency with this knob. Subtle vibrato there. Listen if I go to a noise generator and bring the modulation level up quite a bit. So to get into that old sci-fi computer generator type sound. We've also got a square wave in here. And a triangle wave. Now let's just end up with a nice kind of subtle vibrato there. Now, we could just take the output of that same LFO and feed the other modulation input of our low-pass filters. Let's start with that and jump over here. So the same exact pattern now that's affecting the frequency of our VCO, we're going to bring into this modulation 2 input. Maybe more useful would be to have a separate LFO just for that control. So let's drag that in here. I'm going to call this the cutoff LFO. I'm also going to put that in the second row. And let's feed that guy in right here. Just playing around with the pitch bend there a little bit. That gives you a good sense of what the possibilities are there.